the world is not what we make it to be or what we believe it to be. It has reality apart from ourselves, and we are invited to conform to that.
That is one of the key takeaways from today as we continue to demonstrate how internal family systems, IFS, can be grounded in a Catholic worldview with some modifications. So many Catholics who are interested in internal family systems, who recognize the value of IFS, bring up moral questions. There's a lot of trepidation out there. Can IFS really be Catholic? And sometimes there are spiritual manager parts who really want to stay on the straight and narrow. And today, we are exploring moral questions in internal family systems with the help of philosopher and convert to Catholicism, Alisdair McIntyre. He was on the forefront of Catholic ethics since the 1980s. He is recently deceased. The importance of friendship. That's what he talked about, the importance of friendship in the good life, the moral life, the importance of love relationships, his idea of people as dependent, rational animals, his emphasis on the importance of community, right? All of this was an antidote to the subjectivism of our modern world. And so today we are taking on the topic of values clarification, the myth of a consensus on values. We're taking on subjectivism, that's that idea of, well, it's right for me. It's true for me, right? As though external reality didn't exist. And this can vary from part to part within us, how different parts see what's right and true. And we have a sort of extreme example of this in Ernest Hemingway in his novel Death in the Afternoon. And he's talking in this first person. So this is him talking. He says, so far about morals, I know only that what is moral is what you feel good after, and what is immoral is what you feel bad after. End quote. Nothing could be further from the truth. This is not what we believe as Catholics, but we need to be able to understand how subjectivism connects with our parts. Now, we Malinowskis here on our homestead, we have kept bees for more than a decade. And there's an old saying that if you ask 3 beekeepers a question, you'll get 5 opinions, right? And some of these will contradict. It's an example of parts, right? We need to examine how our consciences are formed, how parts contribute to moral reasoning. And in addition to discussing Alisdair McIntyre today, we're going to be bringing in St. Thomas Aquinas, Dietrich von Hildebrand and his brand of phenomenology, Stephen Jensen, a Thomist, Donald Winnicott, who really was central in object relations theory and his internal object relations, which brings me to this idea from psychoanalyst Erich Fromm. He said, quote, psychoanalysis is essentially a theory of unconscious strivings, of resistance, of falsification of reality according to one's subjective needs and expectations, end quote. Erich Fromm is capitalizing here on how our parts, he wouldn't necessarily have said our parts, but how our parts fashion reality, falsify reality according to their needs and expectations. Historically, one of the measures of mental health is how well a person recognized and accepted reality. And we still see that today, even in the modern American Psychological Association Dictionary of Psychology. Psychosis is defined as, quote, an abnormal mental state involving significant problems with reality testing, end quote. Connecting to reality, though, is more and more countercultural. This quote was attributed to psychologist and author Robert Anthony. Quote, we insist that society should conform to our own subjective illusion of reality, end quote. Insisting that society should conform to our own subjective illusion of reality. Why is this all important? Because we want to be grounded in reality, because if we're not, it's going to be very difficult to love. And so in this episode, we have so many illustrations for you. There's so many layers of self-discovery There is the importance of gaining the trust of our parts so that we can become more integrated, so that parts can broaden their perspectives. And why? There's always four reasons. The first is, how can you tolerate being loved, receiving real love, not counterfeits? How can you better tolerate being loved? Second, how can you love yourself in an ordered way? Third, how can you better love your neighbor? And fourth, how can you better love God? So let's do this together. I am Dr. Peter Malinowski, also known as Dr. Peter. I am your host and guide in this Interior Integration for Catholics podcast. I am so glad to be with you. Thank you for being here. I'm a clinical psychologist, a trauma therapist, a podcaster, writer, co-founder, and president of Souls and Hearts. But most of all, many of you have heard me say this many times, most of all, I am a beloved little son of God, a passionate Catholic who wants to help you to taste and see the height and depth and breadth and the warmth and the light of the love of God, especially God your Father, but also Mary your mother. These are your spiritual parents, your primary parents. I'm here to help you embrace your identity as a beloved little son, as a beloved little daughter of God and Mary. And so all last year, all of 2025, and most of this year, we are doing a deep dive into internal family systems, IFS. We're talking about parts work, and we're grounding it in Catholicism. We're bringing in the insights from internal family systems developed by Dr. Richard Schwartz. We're bringing in other parts and systems models. We're harmonizing them with the truths of the Catholic faith. And why? Again, because it goes back to helping you live out the three great loves and the two great commandments: to love God, to love your neighbor, to love yourself. That's what we're all about. And we're focused on human formation here in Souls and Hearts. We're focused on human formation in this podcast. That makes us different than many Catholic podcasts, many different Catholic outreaches. St. John Paul II described human formation as the basis of all formation. And author and therapist Shannon L. Alder said, quote, "Before you call yourself a Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, or any other theology, learn to be human first," end quote. Here, we are learning to be human. We're learning to be human in this IIC podcast at Souls and Hearts. We're focused on the natural realm. We're focused on metaphysics. We're focused on anthropology. And this is episode 179, titled Parts, Subjectivity, Values, and Morals. It releases on February 2nd, 2026. And I am so excited to introduce to you two new voices here on the Interior Integration for Catholics podcast for this episode. This is really, really good. I'm so excited. And as my co-host today, I am so honored to have Father Thomas Berg. Father Tom is a priest of the Archdiocese of New York. He's a visiting professor at the McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame University. He earned his PhD in philosophy from Rome's Pontifical University Regina Apostolorum in 1999. He served for 13 years as a professor of moral theology and a formation advisor at St. Joseph Seminary in Yonkers, New York. He's a frequent public commentator on issues related to the Catholic Church. He's been published or quoted in the National Catholic Register, First Things, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and most recently in Church Life Journal. And he's the author of Hurting in the Church, A Way Forward for Wounded Catholics. He also co-authored with Dr. Timothy Locke, Choosing Forgiveness, Unleash the Power of God's Grace. And in the past several years, he has personally accompanied several survivors of abuse on their journey to healing. Father Tom is particularly concerned about spiritual abuse, especially in religious life. He was in the Legionary of Christ for 23 years in the Legion, so this affected him personally, and his work with survivors, with trauma, with learning trauma-informed pastoral care, doing spiritual direction, all coincided with him taking a deeper dive into internal family systems about 3 years ago. So with that, it is so good to have you with us, Father Tom.
It's wonderful to be with you, Peter. Thanks so much for the invitation. This is great.
And as my guest expert today, it is wonderful to have Andrea Messineo with us. Andrea completed a licentiate in philosophy in 1994 with the Dominican friars at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Angelicum in Rome, in Italy. She worked for over a decade in the financial industry while completing a PhD in philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. In 2008, she defended her dissertation on incommensurable worldviews in Alisdair McIntyre. So we're going to be bringing a lot of that experience in today. And then she wanted to help others more directly. So she became licensed as a counselor, a therapist. She's been in private practice for more than 14 years. She's licensed in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, and is also approved as a telehealth provider in Florida. She completed her IFS Level 1 training in 2023, and she's on the staff at Souls and Hearts. We are honored to have her with us here. And what a delight to have you with us, Andrea. It's so good to have you. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Peter, for this opportunity to talk with you and with Father Tom about a philosopher that I'm particularly interested in, and I believe was a colleague of Father Tom's there at Notre Dame, Alisdair McIntyre.
So what was he like? You knew him personally, Father Tom?
I only met him once.
Okay.
And the impression when I met him was kind of notorious for having books and piles of paper in his office. But even the 45 minutes I got to spend with him was just very enriching. I mean, he's a man who thought well about a lot of things, and I've enjoyed very much just being a student of his writing and benefiting from especially, I mean, he's written on so many topics, as Andrea knows, but a thinker who thinks well and carefully and really teaches others how to think. I think that's the universal experience of most of his students.
Right, exactly. And I too only met him once when he came and gave a colloquium at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. But yes, his passion for human formation was so evident. And, our focus on him, I think, is so timely because, he just passed away over Memorial Day weekend 2025 at the age of 96. And he has been in the forefront of Catholic ethics since the 1980s. He converted to Catholicism through his teaching of Thomas Aquinas to his students. And he brought Thomistic ethics into dialogue with contemporary thought in a way that is on their own terms, the contemporary thinkers' own terms. And that was what drew me to focus on him. And I'm so excited to be able to meld his thought with internal family systems, or at least attempt to.
Well, it's so exciting to be able to have both of you here today. And what would you want to lead off with or share with us about his thought, human formation, and then this whole idea of parts and systems thinking through an IFS lens, but really grounded in a Catholic understanding of the human person? What does Alisdair McIntyre have to offer us that seems special, unique, helpful?
Okay. Well, I want to connect this back with the conversation in podcast episode 173 with Dr. Anthony Flood, where he was talking about the importance of friendship in the good life, the moral life, and how it's so much a question of relationships. We relate to others as other selves in love, and that's so integral to our progress in virtue. And I remember at one point, Dr. Peter, you asked Dr. Flood a very key question. You asked, well, can there be friendship between unequals? right? As between a parent and a baby. And just that perspective, I think, is really what MacIntyre is focusing on in dependent rational animals, which is where I'm going to draw most of the content today. Because so many of our relationships, both external and internal, are between people and parts that are still in development, still in various phases of dependency and disability, even as we are, or maybe at various times in our life. And, I think that contrasts with ethical models that, talk about moral actors as if we were already just fully formed and perfected, could, relate to each other from a place of self all the time. That's just not the case. So much of human formation is moving from one stage of development to another.
Well, and there's also a dynamism, I would think, in the moment. Like I had a self-defense instructor say to me one time that the only things you really possess is that which you can carry at a dead run. And so and I always held on to that, like, and I think about training, for example, graduate students. There are times when the sea is really calm and the sun is shining and you have capacities that you don't have when the water's rough, and it's stormy out and it's dark. And so there's a developmental dimension to this, and then there's also a dynamic and dimension to this. And I want to think about moral questions too, from the perspective of what are my capacities in this particular moment with the particular difficulties I'm facing right now, the stress levels, where am I in my window of tolerance, all of that. So I love how you're bringing in this idea that we don't live in some sort of rarefied air, where we always have maximal capacity and it's always readily available to us, full access to all our faculties in powers in the moment.
Yeah, it's a process, definitely. And let me try to frame this a bit in parts language, overlapping with a Thomistic model. And for most of my references to Thomistic ethics, I think this book is really helpful. It's by a colleague at the University of St. Thomas, Stephen Jensen, Living the Good Life. Jensen starts out, talking about a very common way of conceptualizing ethics in modern society, and especially in psychological circles. It's often referred to as values clarification, where we just need to look inside, see what are our true feelings and act on them, and that's what's right for us, right? What we feel inside, as opposed to what others, family members, society puts pressure on us to do. And Jensen, following Thomas, kind of counters that and says, if we consult our emotions, or our parts that are carrying emotions, to find out what our true values are, we will get multiple conflicting answers, right? One time I might have a part that really wants to follow rules so I won't get caught or punished, and another time I might have a part that really wants to pursue this secret indulgence. And there is no really perspective from a part that doesn't carry an influence or burden from past experience. So I think the past few episodes of this podcast have done a really great job in setting forth the alternative virtue ethics, where reason, or our innermost self, identifies the good that's out there in the world, and undertakes the task of guiding or directing the parts, the emotions, towards the fulfillment of that good. And I want to say a little bit more about that, but so far,
If I could just jump in, just interesting how in MacIntyre's thought too, and some listeners, some audience might be familiar with this, but that whole idea of values clarification, he kind of looks at that societally, and a big theme in MacIntyre is the interminability of moral disagreement, and kind of the myth of a commonality of values, or values consensus. And he just, great part of his thought is just pointing out that we can never quite get to that, because the whole concept of values itself has become something so utterly subjective, and so hence the need to kind of get beyond this values discourse and look at something actually objective. And that's where kind of turns us back to Aristotle, to the good, to the telos, to what a human fulfilling life is all about, rather than kind of looking at all of these untethered conceptions, personalized conceptions of the good, which, probably, with every person are driven by different parts with different agendas. And so.
Yeah. I love that you brought that up, Father Tom, the notion of, we'll say, incommensurability, right? What I am calling good in my conception is not the same thing as it's like comparing apples and oranges, right? There can be a part, to use parts language again, there can be a manager part that just assumes that what I see as good is just the blanket view, and that everyone, all other parts in the system should conform to that, and that's kind of what MacIntyre calls encyclopedia, reference to the Encyclopedia Britannica, like you view from within a monoculture. And I can have a firefighter part that is a master of suspicion, like we were talking about a few episodes ago, that looks at, well, what is the hidden agenda here? What am I, being forced or manipulated into? I want to rebel against that, right? So the good of the one part is not the same thing as the good that the other is tending to. But the third alternative, and this is where MacIntyre engages contemporary thought on some terms, the third alternative is tradition, as you said, Further Tom, harkening back to Aristotle and Thomas, and learning how to conform to the good that is out there, that is found in the world. And as you said, this is a societal endeavor. This is a community endeavor, because, and this is key for MacIntyre. We learn how to do this in the same way as apprentices learn a craft from a master. I find that to be just such a rich concept, and one that's novel, I think, for many contemporary thinkers, because we're kind of taught to assume that whatever we find when we look inside, that's true for us, that's good for us, and we don't need any further learning or formation. But we wouldn't say that really about any other art or craft. When we're at the beginning, we realize that we need to receive learning. And
that's right. In so much of contemporary society, we're kind of conceived of as these moral automatons who are autonomous, and we craft for ourselves our conception of the good, and therefore what we think is right. And so many misconceptions and deformations of conscience are just mirrored in that these days. If I believe this is right for me, it is therefore right for me. End of discussion. And the community is just expected to respect that, and there's no sense of kind of this deep kind of sense of formation that goes on, that is at the heart of MacIntyre's thought, and that's just something so glaringly empty from, or missing from, much of moral consideration today, at least in the secular sphere.
Right, right. The process of moral education, moral formation, human formation is brought out, so beautifully in dependent rational animals. I'll, maybe consider the idea of disability a bit later, but the initial stages of dependency that we all pass through. MacIntyre, compares the human animal, the rational animal, to other higher animals that also, in the early stages of life, receive care and guidance from elders in their groups. And he points out that, human beings, unlike other animals, have to go through a stage in which they learn to distinguish what appears good to us from what is actually good, right? Dogs, cats, dolphins, they don't have to. Their instincts are accurate. So the dependency that we find in this process is precisely this. We are dependent upon others to guide us from judging what is good only in part to what is in fact good and able to help us reach our goals.
Well, and I see that as a clinician, I see that when I accompany people, that parts have limited vision when there's not this interior integration, and they have, distortions around what's true or distortions around what's good. I think there can be a pull in the broader IFS community sometimes to believe that each part has its own truth, if you will, when what each part actually has is a perspective. It has a way of understanding or making sense out of experience that may or may not conform to what the external realities are. And so there can be this kind of subjectivism that comes in, and it gets confusing too, because when you're thinking about different parts, like what happens when these subjective interpretations of experience conflict with each other, right? And so and one interesting thing about IFS is that for years and years and years, Richard Schwartz denied that there was a philosophical or anthropological basis to his work. He really minimized that. It was very much based off of his experience and the experience of others that were kind of exploring this with him. And one of the beautiful things about the mission of Souls and Hearts is to ground this in an authentic Catholic understanding of the human person. And so that we have the best of both, right? Rather than being caught by either our own parts' subjective experiences and their interpretations of them, or frankly by Richard Schwartz's, to be honest, right? In his interpretation of his experience. So, and there's been a curious lack of curiosity in the broader IFS community to networking or to connecting IFS with philosophy, with theology, with anthropology. And so it's a beautiful thing to be doing this work here.
Absolutely. And, Peter, I think I speak for so many when we're, just to express our, gratitude for what you've all been doing in that. And it's wonderful to be able to participate in this as well. I mean, my early work was in philosophy, now I'm doing more moral theology, but I mean, I am just continually fascinated by the connections as I discover them, even inwardly. Just the valid connections between the most basic principles of Catholic anthropology and what what we kind of understand through internal family systems. So so probably this is work that needs to be done, and that's why I think this particular recent set of series that you've been doing it's so important. So
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. So the human formation aspects of this that MacIntyre really focused on. Yeah, just take us deeper into it, Andrea. What do you think, so what's the next thing we should know? Or if there's something else that you need to feel like you need to broaden out or deepen or understand?
Yeah. I'd love to kind of take a deeper dive into the relationship between MacIntyre's thought and internal family systems, because this is a connection that we're kind of working on here. As far as I know, MacIntyre himself was not aware of IFS, and he cited, as I'll get to in a minute, he cited another psychological model as the one that's best able to accomplish this. But just in general, going from what we were saying about the transition from what seems good to us to what is actually good, what stands in the way often of doing that are adverse childhood experiences, the emotional attachment injuries, woundings that we get along the way. Our moral choices become colored by defensive reactions of parts and their limited perspectives, as you were saying, Dr. Peter, and that greatly reduces the freedom that we have to choose rightly. MacIntyre writes, the practical reasoners enter the adult world with relationships, experiences, attitudes, and capacities that they bring with them from childhood and adolescence, and that always to some significant and often to some very large degree they are unable to discard and disown. And so what practical reasoners present to themselves as a desire for their own good or for the good may in fact be, and often enough is, some unacknowledged form of infantile desire, a type of desire that has been protected from criticism. It's really talking about the role of protector parts, that it's not even safe for these traumatic experiences to come into awareness.
Right.
And I think it's very important for us doing this contemporary work of bringing Thomism into dialogue with IFS to accentuate that aspect of trauma, right? I used to have a professor at the University of St. Thomas who would say, our calling as Thomistic scholars is not just to be repeaters, not just to copy St. Thomas, as in relaying exactly what he said, but to add to it what we can see more clearly from our vantage point. And I think what that is a greater understanding of developmental trauma. And if I could just cite an incident from the life of Aquinas himself, it's kind of well known in his biography that when he was a young man and when he was setting off to join the Dominicans, right, his mother, who was a countess, I believe, locked him in a room for a year to dissuade him from that. She wanted him instead to be an abbot of a wealthy Benedictine monastery. Okay, so the way that this incident is generally interpreted in the literature, this was a test, this was a trial of Thomas's heroic virtue, and he passed. Okay, but just transpose that into your contemporary life. If either of you were to tell me that your parent locked you in your room for a year to dissuade you either from joining the priesthood or from getting married, going to university, and also because this is also part of the incident, sent in a sex worker to try to dissuade you from. I mean, the category that would come to mind is trauma, right?
Yeah.
I just have to say on the side, this is also, I have to believe that colored his whole interpretation of anger. St. Thomas has actually a lot of good things to say about anger. Anger works for him. Anger is the appropriate response to the appropriate emotional response to many experiences of injustice. So I just can't help thinking that,
Yeah, the red hot
must have-
poker. So following on this theme, Jensen writes that growing up in an abusive household is likely to develop a whole different set of emotional dispositions than growing up in a loving environment. Insofar as these emotional dispositions are not voluntary, we are not to blame for them. Aquinas may be more likely to emphasize the role of will in habit formation than we, who are ever aware of the influence of nature and environment. Yet we should still acknowledge the place of will. And this is a question, we're kind of getting into speculative territory. This is a question that I was looking forward to posing to both of you. I was talking earlier about how the rational soul, the intellect, chooses the good in itself and directs, the will and the emotions towards that. I think if we were to speak in parts language, we often do not yet know what our innermost self knows or desires as good. I think we are almost always looking from the perspective of parts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I'm fond of saying that I think the vast majority of people are very blended the vast majority of the time. And I think you're right because the parts are so often driving the bus, so that has an impact on the moral reasoning, and the capacities of the innermost self are often unavailable in the system. But I jumped in on you there. Sorry, Andrea.
Yeah. No, I was just kind of trying to tease that out, because if that is in fact the case, I mean, we can see how the psychological work dovetails with the ethical, the moral work of practical reasoning, right? Because unless we are able to unblend, unless parts in self can unblend, on the human level, then we will not be fully able to make those choices of the good in itself, because we won't be able to see it or to love it, to choose.
Or to be able to distinguish between genuine forms of flourishing and counterfeit forms of flourishing, counterfeit good, so to speak, or misguided. I mean, I also think that, our parts can definitely be attuned to things that are genuinely good, but so often in the wrong way, at the wrong time, maybe in the wrong proportion. But I'm intrigued by this thought of the self not knowing, and it certainly does take a lot of unblending over time. And that just, Andrea, that speaks to me too, of just how the self is also dependent on those persons in the community who can inform those sources of true information that can inform the self. I don't know if that kind of invites you to. I think that would be very much in line with MacIntyre's thought, because and I think of this also in terms of conscience formation. Not that I want to switch onto that topic, but I'm just conscience formation will definitely require sound, prudent, well-formed individuals who will help that individual um, uh, form their conscience.
And that is a difference with IFS because, you know, until relatively recently, Richard Schwartz would say that the innermost self did not need to develop. You know, it had all of its capacities. And then he was starting to get challenged by some folks that were going back to, well, does an infant have an innermost self then? And is its capacities fully generated? So he's modified that, saying it's now, you know, also dependent on the development of the body. But I think there can be this impression that I get from the broader IFS community where there is a kind of, the innermost self is a kind of localized omniscience, you know, in a sense, just knows. And that it, you know, that at least in adults it no longer needs to develop. And I'm hearing a challenge to that. And there are even variations, variability is in the ways that Catholics think about what the innermost self and its nature. But I'm curious about like the integration or the relationship between the innermost self and the community. And I think that's where you were going with this, Andrea. So.
Right. Well, so many levels, the inner and the outer. I mean, and we've, corresponded about this. Certainly I can attest from my own experience, at least in dealing with the most burdened parts, that self does not, in fact, always know how to be with those parts. I mean, just it got nothing here. I take it to prayer, but that is a process, and yourself often needs the input, the dialogue back and forth with parts to get a fuller perspective. I correct Father Tom that often our parts are pointing towards the good, right? I don't want to paint a too negative picture. We need that storehouse of images and intuitions and responses in order to identify the good, and it's not just done in a sterile intellectual environment, right? Thomas has a beautiful quote in the first part of the Summa. The intellect dominates the appetite not in a despotic way, not as a tyrant, but by a politic and royal power, right? Well, what he means by that is that it's not a matter of the intellect and will saying, this is what we're going to do, and everyone else just fall in line. Well, the inner system. There's a dialogue that happens, and it's through as a politician. What does a politician do? He presents his arguments, persuades, tries to win over differing factions to his or her side, because parts have the ability to resist. Yeah, so that's on the inner, and I want to talk about on the outer, in what kinds of communities this sorts of dialogue can flourish, both in groups and in the therapeutic setting. But I'm curious to see if there's anything more on the inside.
Well, no, thank you for that, Andrea. I am just intrigued by maybe thinking about it more, just what the self actually needs to learn from the parts, the perspectives. I mean, this has just really been clicking for me personally in a couple of areas right now, and I realize, it's not the self actually very much needs, even if the agendas that our parts have and the perspectives that parts have are very partial, or they're kind of trapped in a historical moment. Some of the insights that they can have are very valid and very necessary for the self. So I'm just I'm just intrigued by that.
Yeah, and very beautiful, very poignant, even poetic. I find in my own work as well as my work with clients. If any one of those parts, even the most burdened, even parts that are continually weeping or angry, if any one of those voices were lost, it would be a loss to the entire system.
Peter, you have kind of a seafaring image of that, don't you? That how
I think
the
that's
pilot of a
Dr.
ship
Peter's
needs all
image.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think of the innermost self as like the captain of a ship. That's a common, kind of analogy within IFS. And each of the parts, expanding that out, has a role, right? You've got helmsmen, you've got sailmakers, you've got carpenters, you've got the cook, you've got, all these different roles that it takes. And I think that's why we're called to love the Lord our God in the first great commandment with our whole heart, and Jerry Crete, Dr. Jerry, in his book, Litanies of the Heart, locates all of the parts in the heart in his diagram. And so if any of these parts is left out of the loving, just like if any of the instruments of a jazz band is left out, there's a diminishment of the music. If we don't have our trumpet, then there's something going to be missing in that. That doesn't mean that every instrument needs to be playing all the time. There can be times where the musicians are present but quiet. But yeah, I love this question. Just to say on the inside community for a little bit, I'm reminded of this quote by Dietrich von Hildebrand, phenomenologist, in Transformation in Christ, and he said on page 226, he said, by an act of our free personal center, we can either sanction or disavow our emotional attitudes. So I'm thinking, that's emotions, attitudes, beliefs, impulses, desires of parts. We can either sanction or disavow our emotional attitude, which involves a far-reaching modification of the inmost nature of our attitudes. He goes on as an example, a mood of malicious satisfaction, for instance, which we expressly disavow in our mind, is decapitated, as it were, it is revoked and declared invalid, and therefore deprived not only of its outward efficacy, but to a large degree, even of its intrinsic virulence. And so he goes on to say a further distinction commands itself. It makes a considerable difference whether the personal sanction, that is the ultimate act of assent or disapprobation relative to our spontaneous feeling, is issued isolatedly in any random event, as it were, or whether we expressly refer it back to our permanent and moral principles, our habitual basic intention. In the latter case, it has far more meaning and weight. And so he's kind of describing, in phenomenological terms, this tension between what I would say is parts and this free personal center, which would correspond more to the innermost self. The question that comes up for me is that, again, here it seems like Dietrich von Hildebrand assumes that free personal center is fully developed. And I'm just curious in our conversation as to whether MacIntyre would agree with that.
Yeah, I would say that it's very much for MacIntyre a process. It is something that is learned and relearned, of course, in the case of trauma, right? Yeah, because he talks about the ways in which development can go awry, and one way in which we can fail to make that passage from the apparent good to what is actually good, a way that he describes is if the expectations placed on us in childhood are such that we learn early on that we are not to seek, our own good and fulfillment, but to please or placate a parent,
Okay.
or a caregiver, or some significant adult, right? Yeah. If we're put into that kind of situation, or even, as we were saying earlier, even Aquinas being confronted with the challenge to his vocation. Should he honor his mother and her wishes in that situation, or should he remain faithful to his Dominican vocation?
Mm-hmm.
And there are all kinds of ways that dynamic can be perpetuated through the back and forth of parts, and there are ways in which we can become unburdened from that. We do our inner work, we do our work in community, having parts witnessed. I think that's a large part of what we do in the RCC. I think the RCC is an example per excellence of those communities of mutual giving and receiving that MacIntyre endorses.
Mm.
And we can also do it in individual therapy. And Dr. B, if it's okay, I want to be curious with you a moment, because the model of therapy that MacIntyre cites as ideal for repairing attachment injuries of that sort is object relations, Winnicott's
Mm-hmm.
model.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He says that says that what analysts, meaning an object relations analyst, are sometimes able to provide for those whose early childhood experiences were defective is what good mothers and other caregiving adults do provide, a situation in which the child's unqualified trust in such adults releases the creative physical and mental powers expressed in play. So I'm just curious, because I think you're more familiar with object relations than I. I'd like to hear, a bit of your perspective, why he might be saying that, and what advantages you see IF as having over that.
Well, sure. I after originally being trained in cognitive behavioral therapy and then doing some work in health and rehabilitation psychology, I had the good fortune to have a psychoanalyst who was really into object relations, to be able to consult with him and work under his supervision for 7 years, and learned a lot about object relations. And what first of all appealed to object relations among the other different varieties of psychoanalytic thought was how relational it was. That really was really appealing to me. Object relations really focuses on relationships. And it begins to take those relationships inside through this concept of internalized objects. Okay, and so in other words, within you have a representation of mom. Object relations would say, a representation of dad. And so there is this way of understanding the relationship that you have with these internalized objects, or these object representations, these ways of understanding others. And it was really good at being able to, for example, spouses in conflict, often the husband might be arguing with the wife from 10 years ago, in a sense, because that's the object representation that's still there, as opposed to who she is now. And the idea that, these objects representations lag behind the changes that the actual people are making. But it doesn't emphasize nearly to the degree that IFS does the multiplicity of self. There's still this idea that there's still more of a focus on the unity rather than the multiplicity in terms of the aspects, and it doesn't have nearly the capacity, in my opinion, to describe one's internal relationships among oneself. So in object relations, I continued to be dissatisfied with what was offered in terms of answering the question, how does one love oneself? Because to me, that was really important. This idea that loving oneself was so elevated that it needed to be included in the second great commandment, upon which the entirety of the law and prophets depend or hang. Like, what does this really mean? And when I first was exposed to parts work, it was through EMDR and some ways that was incorporating some parts. But then really needing to find a model that spoke to the capacity for one and provided like boots on the ground, actual like guidance for how one loves oneself. That was what was so stunningly eye-opening for me with IFS. And you don't get that in the same kind of way. You know, the idea of Winnicott and the Good Enough Mother and, you know, and other people able to take on these functions and to provide, there was a lot of good in that, and I practiced that way for a while. But I think you get to it much more quickly, much more clearly, much more intuitively with the concepts that internal family systems provide. So is that kind of getting at what you were asking?
Yeah, that really helps a lot. I think I was kind of I don't know, maybe concerned by some of the references to the true self and the false self.
Oh yeah,
You know,
yeah. That's
and that comes up a bit, or you see echoes of it in spiritual literature. Who's the disciple of Thomas Merton? James
Basil
I'm trying-
Pennington is into that.
Yeah, but anyway, divesting ourselves of the false self,
Right.
emphasizing the true self. I mean, we're tending towards that, but we don't want to exile parts in the process.
Yeah, that is a concern, and I have had some thoughts about doing a podcast series or possibly a series of reflections on this, the problematic aspects of the false self, true self kind of thing. And Donald Winnicott, as much as I admire him, you know, engages in that, and at the same time, on the Catholic side, Thomas Merton was as well, and I think that runs a risk of devaluing parts because of misperceptions or because of ways, impulses, desires are the things that are, you know, that are unhelpful or maladaptive or, you know, pull us toward immoral actions and so forth. I think what those parts need is to be integrated and to, and in a sense, to be introduced to the truths that the innermost self has more ready access to, and in a sense to be converted, right? This wholehearted conversion, but not coercively, right? But, you know, not through suppression and not through denial, not through exiling them, because what that does is it just exacerbates polarizations, and it doesn't lead to ultimately internal harmony, because those parts don't just disappear. They're just forced underground. It's sort of like, going back to the ship analogy, you know, you have these, you know, overtaxed spiritual managers who have managed to seal the hatches for all the rebellious parts that are, you know, down below decks. But those parts down below decks, in their mutiny and their desperation, they know how to cut the cables to the rudder so that the helm won't answer, you know. And so it's a radically different model for a lot of Catholics to move away from this condemning of these aspects of self and promotion of these aspects of self, to move toward an integration of the entirety of self that's oriented wholly and toward what's good, true, and beautiful. And that's really what we're looking for. And that's true not just on a psychological level, but I would argue it's true on a bodily level. It's true on the level of the neural pathways that develop in the brain, for example. So there are like physical correlates of all of this that also have to be considered, you know, because so often there's one neural pathway or one neural pathway is trying to suppress, you know, another one, but that other one has not been actually resolved. And so IFS provides a way to conceptualize that and to be able to work with it in a way that I think helps people along the road to sanctity, you know, through that human formation, which is the basis of all formation, according to Pope John Paul II. So, but I'm just curious, you know, Father Tom, it looked like you had something that, you know, was forming.
Sure. Well, like I mean, I feel like I just have a great ringside seat to this wonderful conversation between two therapists, because I'm not a therapist. but I could not agree more that I think for a lot of Catholics coming into IFS, one of the really challenging things is that rather than there's these parts of me that I need to get rid of or suppress, or, that somehow they have to be integrated. And that's just, I find that just one of the most beautiful, and challenging elements, of course, of IFS, but it's really a revolutionary thought. Just circling back to the idea of the development of the self, I just wanted to throw out, tell me if if you would agree, both of you, but it just, just thinking about an experience. So I think just the very capacity to unblend, and I think for anyone coming into IFS, one kind of very eye-opening things is learning how to unblend and to discover, oh my goodness, I've had these parts that have been in the driver's seat for such a long time, or so frequently. Just that very unblending and kind of this discovery of self, I would argue that is already kind of a development. And I think my personal experience, myself is always being informed. There's there's so many of these aha moments, like, oh my gosh, or I'm every time I realize that I'm blended, I'm learning something about my parts, but I'm also learning something about myself. So I think it just seems that the whole notion of the development of the self, that happens on many levels, but a lot of it is just it's kind of an education, and it's information, and it's discovering my parts and how to relate to them. And Andrea, yeah, I mean, going back to what you were saying, I think it's very true also that can have this kind of self can feel just kind of very helpless at times. I just don't know what to do with this part, with this maybe an exile, or but it just seems to me that there's a constant learning experience going on for the self, and that the self, I need the input, the information, the insights that are coming from my parts. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, 100%. It is a very experiential process, and it is a very bodily or somatic process. I want to kind of bring in that aspect of integration, integrating mind and body. That's also part of this. MacIntyre, when he's thinking of practices, when he's thinking of traditions, he's thinking of his childhood in Scotland, where there were fishing and farming communes, and how the elders of those communities pass on that lore to others. I mean, it's very tangible. And he, in the one time that I heard him speak in Houston, shortly after the publication of Dependent Rational Animals, there was a question from the audience. How do you, Professor MacIntyre, feel that the youth of today, the despairing, suicidal youth, can be helped? And he said, well, there are always the options of military service or work aboard an Alaskan fishing boat, right? And that is an example of his dry wit, of course. But what he meant by that was those two and similar endeavors bring us back into connection with the body, with objective reality, right? With the idea that the world is not what we make it to be or what we believe it to be. It has reality apart from ourselves, and we are invited to conform to that. And it's a process of it is a very difficult process, but it's an extremely rewarding process. That ever going ever deeper in layers of self-discovery that you were referring to, Father Tom. I often tell my clients it's the work that we get to do. We get to bring this good news to our clients, to those that we counsel, to their parts that are in darkness, that haven't heard the good news. And you may ask, well, how haven't they heard the good news? Because they're all part of our systems, and those of us who are believers, we have received the faith. But it's not that they don't know it, but they haven't experienced it. They haven't had that felt experience. So a rebel
Right.
part, for example, she knows, but she doesn't care, right? Because her role is to protect the system in a different way of getting some immediate pleasure. So it's just I'm at a loss for words for the beauty of what we get to do.
Yeah, and Dr. Peter Martin, has this discussion of internal evangelization of parts, and it's not primarily intellectual. And going back to sort of some of Sherry Waddell's work, this idea, and she's talking about this in terms of, external relationships, that there's often this need for pre-evangelization, which is based on trust and trust in someone or something that's Catholic, and that provides the basis to begin to not just have an intellectual discussion, but to have an experience of what I would call love, an experience of authentic love. And so Peter Martin, draws that out in terms of this concept of internal evangelization. And it was one of the episodes in the 150s. I can't remember exactly which episode it was, but inner evangelization. And I think that is when parts can come to some experience of the good news of the gospel, because frankly sometimes it just sounds like words to parts. It just sounds like concepts, and it doesn't seem like that it's got an immediate relational reality to it. And oftentimes they're picking this up through spiritual managers who are oppressing them, who are condemning them, who are being rough with them, manhandling them. And that's why in this work, at least as a psychologist, I don't immediately start with a Jesus-centric approach, because I don't know where each part is in terms of its of that part's image of Jesus, how that part understands Jesus. And I talk about that a lot in episode 131 on God's role in your human formation of this podcast, especially when there's been spiritual trauma, especially when there's been, real neglect or even abuse by those that somehow represent God in some way. It can be extremely fraught with difficulties to start with an approach that immediately brings in religious figures. I think sometimes parts really need to develop that trust first. They really need to have a taste of what love is first before they can experience directly the author of love. So.
And that just resonates so much. Resonates personally. I always kind of have before me this image of, the self and the good shepherd. At least that works for me. The gentle shepherd who has to shepherd the parts. And I very much love that whole notion of this pre-evangelization of parts. It's so true.
Mm-hmm.
And witnessing, inviting each part to be fully heard and known and understood. That happens on the inside as well as the outside. When the MacIntyre writes about the communities of mutual giving and receiving that practical moral reasoning happens in, he writes, what each individual has, and I just substitute the word part, what each part has is a history that is particularly her or his own, and to invite an individual to make her or himself intelligible to us, perhaps as a preliminary to justifying her or his actions, or the extreme behaviors of parts, is to invite that individual to tell us as much of that history as is needed. Right? So there's so much space, there's so much time to do this work, because parts have so much, once they are in relation to self, and as Dr. Peter said, they've started to experience that love, that reflection of the image of God that self gives to them. They just open up. They want to be heard. They want to be known by self. That he means. No, it's beautiful. So I wonder if there's time we can pass a bit. We talked about, concepts of dependency and growth in development. We can talk a bit about the other concept that MacIntyre brings out of disability.
Okay.
Right? That's a feature of these communities as well. What do we do in the case of individuals who are permanently disabled for one reason or another, that we don't expect to become independent, practical moral reasoners? And I hadn't thought so much about applying that conversation to inside, but we certainly could explore that. What does IFS tell us about parts that have been so wounded by life that their condition seems chronic? Right. MacIntyre says, at least on the outside, that communities of moral inquiry must be evaluated on how they view disability, because each one of us has been at one time and will again be dependent on others.
Mm.
So we need to be able to trust in their just generosity, right?
Oh, yeah.
And this is kind of a different ideal than Aristotle's great-souled or great-hearted men, right? That the prominent people in the community were the ones that were the most able, the most developed, the most able to give. What do we do in the case of individuals that seem that they need to be receiving care? Mm-hmm. So,
Well, that's and it's really important, because so often there is this emphasis on functionality, this emphasis on productivity, of being able to, quote, contribute in some, readily identifiable way that's valuable to society, that's recognized in secular society as valuable. And there can be within that a loss of the sense of the ontological goodness of the human person. And I think taken inside, there can be a loss of the sense of the ontological goodness of each part of a person, because parts become confused with their burdens. Manager parts, will look at a part not as a part, but as a problem, or as only their maladaptive desires or their problematic attitudes or beliefs. And so there can be this desire, going back to what we were talking about before, for essentially a partectomy, that the parts simply be chopped off and discarded, right? Without understanding that that part is integral to their personhood. And then going back to some of the episodes on for example, St. Maximus the Confessor, the macrocosm, the microcosm, I think how we look at these questions and these situations inside of us is going to impact the way that we look at things, outside of us, right, in society and in our culture. So if we believe that parts of us are expendable or that are best to be removed, there can be the same sort of attitude toward others. St. Thomas Aquinas talked about how the way we love ourselves or don't love ourselves is the radix et forma, the root and form of the way that we love others, and the template by which we love others. So I think a lot can be inferred about how we look at our own internal disabilities, or parts that are struggling in various ways, by the way that we look at these the sort of the analogs writ large outside of ourselves.
Yeah, I like that take
Just
very much, Dr. B.
It's just making me think of, again, there's so much in kind of traditional Catholic asceticism that favors the partectomy. We're predisposed to that, or the part suppression, or we need here is just more penance and more mortification. And I just think this is one of the most challenging and beautiful areas of, where IFS kind of meets the world of Catholic asceticism. And how do we understand this? What does it mean? Yes, obviously we have parts that sometimes are just deeply burdened, and yes, can't act out. We have to work at their integration. We have to and that are problematic, but we don't want to internally treat them like problem children, right? So we want to, what does it mean to strive to grow in virtue, to rightly order our behavior, and at the same time to offer love and mercy to those parts of us that, just really may be so severely burdened and stuck that, they're disabled in a sense. It's just striking me that that's quite a challenge, and that can be a very challenging place where, especially Catholics who are kind of looking at IFS, may not be sure just how to navigate that, or what to do with that.
I find it really helpful for clients that I'm working with clinically, who have experience raising children, either their own or their nieces, nephews, others, to think about these parts as like little children. And would we treat a 2.5-year-old or a 3-year-old, in the same way that we're, kind of treating a part of us that phenomenologically is presenting at that age, for example, and is upset and burdened. At the same time, I think sometimes there can be concerns from serious Catholics about, so are you saying that sort of anything goes, we just accept anything? And I think there's a real important distinction between acceptance of a desire or an attitude or an impulse, and endorsement of that impulse, or that desire or that attitude. That there again, there's the sanctioning and disavowing that von Hildebrand talks about, and so we can make those distinctions. And I find that to be quite pragmatic about it, in the sense nothing that I've tried has worked better, both in my own personal life and in working with others, accompanying others, than to love these parts. And I think it's entirely consistent with our, with our Catholic faith that that what Plato said in the Republic, that if a man loves a thing, that means he loves all of that thing. He doesn't just pick and choose certain aspects of it. And so there's an integrity or an integral aspect of loving the entirety of the person, whether that's ourselves or somebody else. And I found that it becomes so much easier to love similar parts in other people if we can love those parts within ourselves. And so I can certainly appreciate and resonate with, concerns about, does this mean that we're just abandoning, moral principles, and we're just, just loving on these parts in some sort of like 1970s Kumbaya fest or something like that. But no, I mean, but we also want to make sure that it actually is love. It's not just, aggression, and frustration hiding under the guise of tough love or something like that, or distorted understanding of asceticism. And one of the doctors of the church that has some really unique insights into this is Saint John of the Cross. If you read his Dark Night of the Soul, you'll see that he says that it's common to have sexually intrusive thoughts, intrusive thoughts that are sexual, and when you are in the dark night, or to have blasphemous thoughts, and he doesn't take a polarizing approach to those. In contrast to some other writers, there's an acceptance that those exist, and there's no endorsement of the content of those. But I think we can now take it to the next level and see that parts may be active with those sorts of things, and they're expressing something of their experience, or at least how they've interpreted their experience, often in very young ways. And if we can get curious about those messages without embracing the content, we can help those parts. And I think that opens the door to a lot of healing, not only for folks that are experiencing obsessions or compulsions or all other kinds of symptoms, but even folks that are struggling with scrupulosity, but that are suffering with just about any type of psychological symptom. Understanding it as a way of a part trying to communicate distress, and parts are going to do that in a way that get our attention, because a symptom that doesn't get one's attention isn't particularly valuable, to a part. It doesn't actually get the job done, if you will.
Peter, the image I have coming to mind, I've witnessed this many times as a celibate. I've never had to do this, but just friends of mine with little children, right? So whether it's in the store and the 3-year-old is throwing a tantrum, a temper tantrum, and the way of handling it begins with getting down at the child's level, and mommy looks at Jimmy and starts with, Jimmy, I understand you're not happy right now, right? So I validate what you're feeling, okay? We're not going to be able to proceed this way,
Right.
But, so again, I'm just like, okay, I hear you, I see you, I understand you. I know you're not happy, or I know whatever that part might be expressing. So it's
communicating
and endorsement,
and communicating that I love you and that you're valuable. Like,
yes.
It's not just like, I need you to shut up because you're embarrassing me. A lot of parental discipline is actually driven by the shame of parents. Actually, if you actually look at like what happens in parental discipline, parents tend to discipline most harshly when the child is somehow touched on something that activates shame, and the sort of the anger and a whole bunch of other things are a reaction to that. To the parent trying to contain the external environment so that their internal environment does not become unstable. So we want to make sure that when we are engaging in discipline, that it's also fostering the self-governance in the long run of the child, and that's something that was such a major theme for St. Thomas Aquinas, and then is being expanded upon, which I'm really enjoying by MacIntyre. Because I've not read MacIntyre. I've just full disclosure. I've actually been intimidated by MacIntyre's work. I'm like,
Not an uncommon reaction to reading MacIntyre for the first time.
Oh yes, his style of writing. You could start off, at the paragraph, and by the end of the paragraph, you realize that it's been all one sentence,
It's all one sentence, exactly.
with multiple compound phrases, and you have to look back and see, to which subject the predicate refers. So,
He was not known for editing his own work
Yeah.
that much. He
Yeah.
was-
yeah. But even Dr. Peter, without having read him, see how beautifully everything dovetails. It's just coming right back to the beginning, and I think that's a sign that we're on the right track in the work that we're doing. I'm so excited. I mean, I'm coming away from this conversation with new trailheads to follow. I love the parallel that's emerging between how we treat the dependent and disabled parts of ourselves internally, and how we are towards others who are such in our communities and society. Because we would need a whole other episode to develop this, but this is one of my areas of interest, how the faith supports or challenges those with disability, and talking about the good that parts bring to us as well. I think that and this is kind of like going on. This is a trailhead, as I said. It's important to keep in mind that a lot of our conceptions of disability are culturally conditioned, and that what passes for such in our time, historically would have had a very different interpretation. In my book, Alone in Church, I reflect upon many instances of holy men and women who displayed what we would clearly describe as autistic traits today, but yet it contributed to and enhanced their holiness. And so, I thank you both for that richness, that added layer.
Well, as we kind of come to the end of our time today, we still have 5-6 minutes maybe. I'm just curious, like what is really important to you, each of you, if you're willing to talk about this personally, about IFS, parts work, the coming together of a Thomistic understanding of the human person, kind of expressed by MacIntyre. How has this made a difference? Maybe we could put it like this for you, that it's not just fascinating ideas. It's not just, kind of all going on in the realm of the mind. I know for me that, and I alluded this before, like I was mystified about the actual loving myself, and yet I knew it was really important, because if that's how I'm supposed to love others, and a lot of my career has been to try to figure out the answer to that question, like how does one love oneself in an ordered way? And if you read Aristotle, Plato, we talked about this with Dr. Flood, back in those earlier episodes. There's a sort of ideal that's presented, but can we get to the how? And so what was lovely about this for me, what was just mind-blowing, is that, wow, I can have a dialogue within myself, with different parts being subject and object. Like, wow, like who knew? Who knew? And this was after I'd been steeped in object relation stuff. I was trying to find the edges of the most relational types of therapeutic modalities. And so So what really brought this home for me was just my own experience and like, wow, I can love myself better. And now that I can love myself better and I can accept these parts of myself, I can love others better. I can love my children better. I can love my wife better. I can love, I can love my neighbor better. And this is helping me along the road to sanctity. This is helping me along the road to salvation. It's helping me with the human formation pieces that I did not know I had difficulties with, or I did know I had difficulties with, but I didn't know what to do about it. So yeah, to not have to condemn or reject or distance myself from the parts of other people that corresponded, that were counterparts to my own exiles, to the parts of me that my managers were exiling. Like that was so huge for me. So I'm just curious if there's something that, because each of you have been drawn to IFS in various ways, if there's something personal that you'd like to bring in about that, without pressing for anything, or trying to overexpose any parts. Check with your systems, check with your parts to make sure that it seems right and good to them to share this, because this is a public forum and so forth. But yeah, if there was something that your parts wanted you to speak for them on that, we'd love to hear it.
Well, I could just jump in. I mean, I think there's a multifaceted answer to that, but just one part of the answer, I think, is, for example, just piggybacking on what you shared, Peter. I have a very similar experience after, many years of being in, seminary formation and in the formation business. We often use the word integration. But my experience for many years was, what does that mean? It sounds nice, but what does it actually mean? And I think one of the tremendous values of IFS is just to open it up for making this world of, well, this is what, in a deep dive, this is what integration really means, and especially. Yeah, again, especially kind of in a seminary formation context where, obviously one of the huge challenges, even more so today, both for seminarians, for priests especially, but, it's the ongoing integration of sexuality, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the Catechism defines chastity in terms of integration. And I just think the tools of IFS just really give us a wonderful window into not just understanding, but also implementing on how do we, and just the whole richness of what it means to be doing the inner work and leaning into that work of knowing, understanding my parts, discovering them, and loving them. Anyway, that's just one piece of what I could say about that.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you, Father Tom.
Just beautiful. And I want to second, yes, what both of you are saying. In my experience, discovering parts work has been a freeing experience. I had no idea before how the deficits in my human formation, in my self to parts connection, were presenting obstacles to grace and progress in the spiritual realm. And it's as if I was given wings, so to speak. And I see that in my own life and the life of my clients, and I'm able, thanks in great part to this work, to engage in these kinds of dialogues, in these kinds of giving and receiving. I was speaking for parts just before we started. In the past, I would have been, caught between the rock and a hard place, or the internal critic part that was so afraid of saying the wrong thing, and a part that would have frozen me up to prevent me from saying anything at all. And now I'm, offering continuing education
Mm-hmm.
seminars in this very topic. To formators, I welcome anyone to contact me who's interested in continuing these conversations. So very
Yeah, and I'll
grateful.
encourage folks to check that out. Do you have a website or a way that you would like folks to contact you?
Yeah. They can contact me through my website. It's Andrea Messineo, LPCC.com. Or you can just email me at a.messineo@att.net. I'd love to start the conversation, and anyone who's able to get credits CE through NBCC. Yeah.
Beautiful. And we'll put those links in the description on our YouTube YouTube channel as well, or our YouTube description for this episode, along with a link to your book Alone in Church. And and Father Tom, is there anything that you would like us to kind of know about that you're up to that we could draw some attention to at this time?
Well, just up to a lot of stuff. Continuing my own work in parts work, and just trying to support people and in this. I have a number of spiritual directees who are doing parts work simultaneously. So I'm one of the kind of personal projects I have gone is just kind of discovering this wonderful, enriching overlap between spiritual direction and IFS and parts work, and it's and just that's just a very fruitful thing. So thank you again for this opportunity. This has just been really enriching.
Well, I am so glad that both of you were here, and I am super excited for our next episode 180, where we will all be rejoining. We'll get the band back together, and we will be exploring more of these topics around parts and moral questions, around the formation of moral conscience, around concupiscence, and all kinds of other types of things. So we will be able to continue
Great
that.
stuff.
Yeah, it's great stuff. I mean, it's really important stuff. So if you liked this episode, give us a like. Go ahead to YouTube or whatever podcast platform you're on and like this episode. Subscribe to the IIC podcast. Join our conversation on our YouTube channel at Interior Integration, numeral 4 Catholics. Interior Integration for Catholics. Links to Father Tom Berg's books are in our YouTube description. And links to Andrea Messineo's practice are there also, as well as her book, Alone in Church. I want to tell you, the Resilient Catholics community, it's now open. It's February. The RCC opens every February, June, and October. So the RCC is now open for new members. We are taking applications, and that will happen until the end of February. So if you are a Catholic who sees how important structure is for your personal human formation, if you want to shore up your natural human formation foundation for your spiritual life, if you want to really get into your human formation arithmetic and really learn that arithmetic so you can do your spiritual formation algebra, and if you want to bring in this parts and systems thinking, IFS, grounded in a Catholic understanding of the human person, consider the Resilient Catholics community. The RCC offers you a structured program. There's a community of like-minded Catholics. We meet in small groups. We're flourishing and thriving as we journey toward loving God wholeheartedly, right? Loving God with all our parts, loving our neighbors as ourselves. Check it out, soulsandhearts.com/RCC. Hundreds of Catholics have found the RCC to be helpful in their human formation. And why? Because we're not journeying alone. We're going together. We're bringing together the best of secular and spiritual resources to help you experience what love is at a bones level across all your parts, right? So that every part of you can participate in that love. Check out more at our RCC landing page, soulsandhearts.com/RCC. Consider doing our 19-minute experiential exercise that can help you discern whether it's a good idea to apply to the RCC. There's still, even if you apply, there's a mutual discernment process on your end, on our end, that includes our Parts Finder Pro. That's a set of 23 measures that helps you to come to understand 10 to 15 of your parts, managers, firefighters, exiles, how they relate to your innermost self, how they relate to each other. You'll get feedback on your Parts Finder Pro, your PFP, through a 6 to 7 page report. And there's a 15-minute Zoom interview where we go over it with you with a Souls and Hearts staff member. That's all included in the $499 application fee. If you need financial assistance for that, contact Pam at office@soulsandhearts.com. And I want to also let you know that for you Catholic formators, so we're talking Catholic therapists, spiritual directors, priests, coaches, those who are professionally responsible for the formation of other Catholics, we have a number of offerings for you starting soon, right? We just had a webinar on IFS Basics, and a recording of that webinar is now available on our Formation for Formators landing page at soulsandhearts.com/FFF. So we go over the basics there. We also go over the basics in this podcast in episodes 157, 158, and 159. We are in the final weeks of our registration for our spring foundational experiential groups. No IFS training is necessary for those. And, those are led by IFS trained professionals. So there's like professional accompaniment on these. I'm leading one, and so is Bridget Adams, so is David Edwards. And there's also several advanced groups that are available for IFS Level 1 trained individuals, or for those who have already completed an FEG or maybe the Stepping Stones program. So I wanted to let you know about those. And if you have questions about any of this, you're welcome to reach out to me. My email, crisis@soulsandhearts.com. You can also call me on my cell phone, 317-567-9594. That's my private cell phone number, especially on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 4:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Eastern time during my conversation hours. We can have a conversation up to 10 minutes, maybe 12 or up to 15. And it is just so good for me to be able to talk with you. And with that, let's draw this to a close by invoking our patroness and our patrons, Our Lady, our Mother Untitled of Knots,
Pray for us.
Saint Joseph,
Pray for us.
For us.
Saint John the Baptist,
Pray for
Pray
us.
for us.